here. Thank you for hosting us. My name is Ben Chu. I am BBC Newsnight's economics editor. It's great to be with you this afternoon to talk about Bank of England accountability. Since I've been covering the Bank of England, there's been more unhappiness with it than at any time I can remember. And it's not just from people like you in the audience, it's the public as well. The net disapproval ratings are at the highest they've been on record since the bank went independent, I think. So our topic today, Bank of England accountability, is obviously very resonant. I'm going to introduce who I'm on this panel with. Lord Bridges, first of all, is the chair of the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee. He was the minister who took the last Bank of England Act in 2016 through the House of Lords. And this was the bill, I'm sure you will all remember, that made the Court of Directors a smaller and more focused and unitary board. And he also put the Prudential Regulation Committee on the same footing as the Financial Policy Committee and the Monetary Policy Committee. Welcome to you, Lord Bridges. Martin Wolf, he's the Financial Times columnist and author most recently of The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And Kate Barker, who was the author of the Barker Review of Housing Supply in 2004. And I gather the only external MPC member to have been appointed for 3 terms. Is that correct? Excellent. The latest of which ended in May 2010. So here's how it's going to work in this session. Lord Bridges, you're going to talk about the House of Lords Economic Committee's report on the Bank of England, which is called Bank of England, How is Independence Working?, which I think was prompted by the 25th anniversary of the Bank of England Act in 1998. So George is going to tell us about that. Then you'll talk about the overall remit of the report. But then what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into themes that are going to come out of the report, and then we're going to make it as interactive as possible so we can get as many questions and responses from Martin and Kate as possible. Those themes are going to be, first of all, performance of the bank versus achieving its 2% inflation target, the nature of the target itself, whether that should be changed, other bank objectives, diversity of thought, and then finally, mechanisms for accountability. And we're going to spend roughly about 15 minutes on each one, and we'll have questions on each of those. So if you try and keep to the themes, we can get through as many areas as possible, but let's try and keep them tightly around those individual themes, and bear in mind that other themes are going to come up. So yes, George is going to kick off each of those themes, and then Martin is going to respond to the first one, then Kate, and it will work like that, and then we'll have questions as well. So let's start. George, tell us about this House of Lords Economics Committee's report. What are you trying to achieve with it?
Very good. Thanks very much, Ben. And first of all, 3 very, very quick things. First of all, congratulations to the organisers of this conference. It is an incredibly important conference. For reasons we'll come on to, I think that the level of accountability and scrutiny of the Bank of England is absolutely pivotal, and this conference plays a very, very important role in that. Second point, thanks to the witnesses who gave evidence to our inquiry. There are a large number of them, many of them are here today, and I'm going to cite some of them. And third, a big word of apologies. You may have heard that there is this report. It has not yet been published. Now, this puts me in a very difficult position because I can talk to you all about the evidence that we have received, but I'm very sorry to say, and I'm an old-fashioned stickler for observing parliamentary process, I can't go into the conclusions. So I will be teasing you as to where we might be going. As Ben said, absolutely right. We launched this inquiry back in March to mark the 25th anniversary of the bank being given operational independence. The title of this panel is about bank accountability. The remit of the inquiry goes obviously wider than how the bank is held accountable per se. It is looking at the operational performance overall. We tried to seek to establish whether independence is working, and by that we meant, are the objectives appropriate for an independent central bank, and are they suitable given the tools at its disposal? Is the bank's governance and structure conducive to an effective operation and one free of bias? And given the enormous power in the hands of those at the bank, is it being held suitably accountable, and is it being scrutinised effectively? Now, as we went along, and I need to stress this now, as we went along, given the evidence we were receiving and the enormous potential scope of that inquiry, we've decided to focus more on the performance of the MPC, and we've set aside the work of the PRC, FPC, and the bank's role as a resolution authority. We do look at the bank's financial stability responsibilities, but only insofar really as they relate to the MPC governance and accountability. And I want to be very, very clear, what we are not looking at is specific decisions that the bank has taken or its handling of specific events. So we don't go down a rabbit hole on anything specific. And final point, just as Ben was saying, I think when you look at it, and we can split it up, we structure our inquiry and the evidence we got into the following buckets. As you say, the bank's performance at controlling inflation since '97, its role and remit, its diversity of views and governance, and the opportunities for challenge, critical, and finally, and absolutely pivotal, accountability and scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Okay, George. Well, let's kick off with that question about whether independence has worked overall. Tell us some thoughts.
So yes. So again, caveat here. Any journalist here, this is the evidence that we received. The fact that inflation has been low and stable through much of the past 25 years was absolutely generally seen as an endorsement of the bank's independence. And I should stress it's inheriting an inflation target framework. For many witnesses, this did reflect the removal of political distractions from the principal aim of achieving price stability. That said, it's not that witnesses thought independence as a panacea as far as price stability is concerned, and it was very much recognised by many that there were disinflationary forces at play, not least globalisation, which probably helped to produce similar inflation profiles across the G7. But it was generally acknowledged that independence has bestowed valuable credibility, a word that came up a lot in the previous panels, on the pursuit of the target. And I would just cite here a couple of pieces of evidence. One, Charles Goodhart, I don't know if Charles is here. The fact that independence has been introduced means that there is a greater likelihood of interest rates being adjusted for economic reasons rather than to pursue the political objectives of whatever government it might be at the time. And Sir Paul Tucker, it's hard to imagine navigating the country out of grave financial crisis if a minister had been deciding interest rates and monetary policy. I can't think what event he was thinking about, but there we are. So I'll end there.
Okay, that's great. Well, that's really good place to kick off. So Martin, do you want to respond to that? Overall, in your view, do you agree with what George was outlining, that most people who gave evidence suggested it has worked?
Yes, I have to. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't here this morning, and I apologize if I repeat everybody's wisdom. But anyway, that's what a journalist is for, so I don't feel terribly guilty. I was also one of the witnesses, so and I have a suspicion that I might have said similar things. So my answers would go roughly as follows. When I thought about 6 points, and there's a first point. I mean, I've been around long enough watching this that I think we can say with very great confidence, though there's always the possibility of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, but clearly and definitively until recently, the record of inflation, which is what they were supposed to control, was of a completely different order from what it was in the previous 25 years. So if one is comparing it with the historical experience, which was a mess, I mean, and I could go back the previous 30 years, we remember inflation peaked at one point, I think at 25%, in the mid-70s, clearly it's worked in that sense. And we shifted to this system, it must be remembered, precisely because our system hadn't worked and because other systems, notably the Bundesbank's, which was very much the model, seemed to work much better throughout all those shocks. So we couldn't just say it was because of the world, because others did better. So that, I think, was right, and it is right. Second, in terms of its performance on inflation, since it was given in operational independence with the target, it's pretty well in line with that of its major peers. Until recent experience, the inflation upsurge, actually in the rather difficult 2010s, when the Fed and notably the ECB fell persistently below target. That wasn't the case here. We were actually closest to the target. I think it's mostly accident, but at least you could say they actually did better than the ECB and even to some degree the Fed. Third, it's pretty clear that global forces simply because it's also similar, must have played a quite important part in generating the disinflationary environment. And now that we are attributing our current mess to global forces, it would seem rather ridiculous to say global forces only harm us and never help us. And it's pretty clear they did help us, and I'm not going to go into why, but globalization was certainly one factor. Ken Rogoff wrote a wonderful paper on that about 20 years ago. So that's the third thing, and it's pretty clear if there's huge inflation shock in the world, we really can't insulate ourselves completely from that. Fourth, if you look at where we are now, nonetheless, and you have to think about it, we are pretty adrift from target. So I wrote a column which I got vastly less response than I expected, but it showed that if you start with the time when we moved to CPI targeting for the 2%, which was 2003, 4. Didn't want to go into the problem of shifting between two indices. And you assume that the aim would have been, if they mostly got it right, an average inflation of 2%. We're now 17% above what that would have implied. So essentially that's because we've done 10 years of 2% in 3. And is the bank partly responsible for that? Well, we'll have to come to that in a moment. But it's pretty clear right now we are way adrift of what the target would have implied. And of course, that shows that the inflation target has been huge, shock has been huge, and there's a very big debate to be had of whether the bank could possibly have done better in managing it. I'm not going to go into that now, but I think the big lesson I draw from that is the chances that they will actually manage the inflation target symmetrically over time are near zero. And the reason is that, and then my view is that inflation shocks upwards in a way it never shocks downwards. The probability of having 10% inflation was clearly much higher in any period, we did have 10% inflation, than -8. So that's a sort of question about the target. And final little point I'd make is I think the experience has shown that both forward guidance and attempts to make current inflation targets, to adjust current inflation targets in light of what has happened in the previous 10 years or whatever, these are all mistakes. One just has to stick with the inflation target on a forward-looking basis, but one should never say what one's future policy is going to be, because while you understand it's all conditional on conditions, I don't think the world does, and the world is too uncertain to be in the least bit confident about what appropriate monetary policy will be a year or two from now.
Mm-hmm. Right, very good. So, Kate, we'll get your thoughts on this question, but first let's get a couple of questions from you guys in the audience. So please, we've got some roving mics. On this question, has independence worked overall? As I think we've been hearing, it probably has, but with some caveats. Would anyone like to make a point or ask a question on this subject? Put your hand up and try and catch my eye, if you do. There's a lady here.
Thank you. Lisa McSorley, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. When we're talking about Bank of England's independence, it was 25 years ago since its remit was established. Do you think it is more an issue of educating the public and even politicians about what the actual remit is, that it is actually, unlike the Fed, it's not a dual mandate, but it does take into account the wider economic conditions of the government of the day?
Okay. Well, let's Kate, maybe you can take that one. Do we need to educate people more about what the Bank of England is trying to do?
One of the things that struck me looking through... by the way, I should say first, I also think this is a great conference because it brings lots of people together, and I really like it. I don't really work in economics anymore, so it enhances my social life no end, so thank you very much. But to be serious, when I read the evidence, there was quite a lot about the, again, I think we'll come to some of this later, about the nature of the mandate and taking into account with regard to, which actually in my first years on the MPC, we talked about surprisingly little. I often look back and think, would I have voted differently on any occasions if we'd had a dual mandate? I'm not at all sure I would, but I worry that that's actually just me being kind of nice about myself. But I think it is important for politicians to understand that the way the bank behaves is as a result of the mandate that they were given. The prime focus is clearly price stability. And that means that they are going to be laser-like focused on that. When I look back, and I've said this quite frequently recently, when I look back at the whole way in which independence was set up, the great thing at the time was only the monetary policy can manage the cycle, and the fiscal policy just creeps on along underneath, looking after deficits and debt. I don't think that works with big shocks. And when we've had big shocks, the fiscal politicians have looked to monetary policy to do too much and brought the second half of the mandate into play. And I think that's been unhelpful. And I think fiscal policy should have taken more responsibility for managing the cycles, because it's important to remember that fiscal policy is the first mover in this game. They set the mix. Monetary policy then reacts with fiscal policy to set the inflation rate. That's basically how it works. And if fiscal policy isn't set helpfully, monetary policy will struggle with its role.
Did you want to come in, George, on this?
Well, here I have to be very careful that I'm not getting into our conclusions, but if I sort of nod very much in your response to your question, do we need politicians to understand this more? Absolutely. I've got the remit letters here. I read them more and more. The more I read them, the more I think how many people down in Westminster are reading them. TSC does a very good job. I'd like to think our committee does its job, but to what extent the publication of the remit letters is scrutinised was a subject that our witnesses came up against time and again. And you hit a very important nail on the head, which we might come back to, as regards also the expansion of the remit.
Yes, and obviously the media has a role to communicate the remit as well.
Of course, the media has a role.
Is there any more questions on this broad area? Let's go to that gentleman at the back. Yes.
Thanks. So, I mean, historically, the role of the central bank has arguably been primarily a financial stability mandate. Would anyone make the case these days that what the Bank of England can do most effectively is concentrate on its financial stability mandate, as we saw during the LDI crisis when those mandates were conflicting? The Bank of England was able to respond quite well to that, whereas its tools aren't actually that well equipped to deal with inflation. If we look at the primary drivers of inflation, what do people think about that?
Martin, do you want to pick that up? You expert on financial stability.
Well, I have this later in this discussion, so we're leaping ahead. My view, well, to just say what I would say or might say, but not, I won't repeat myself. We have certainly learnt that monetary stability defined in terms of hitting the inflation target is not a sufficient condition. I won't go into whether it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for financial stability. And financial instability, if it occurs on a sufficiently large scale, can make hitting the inflation target itself extremely difficult. And as Kate rightly observed, which I was also going to say, in those situations, fiscal and monetary policy have to work together. And I would be inclined to agree that because of the separation of the two, particularly in the few years after the financial crisis, they were working in opposition in a profoundly unhelpful way. So finding out a way of getting monetary and fiscal coordination work better, and I think we had similar problems after COVID, is clearly very important in a crisis. However, so that goes a little bit from your question. However, I think it will be, to put it bluntly, and it's a provocative question, so I'll give a provocative answer, and I apologize for that, pretty well insane if we said the only thing we should worry about in the Bank of England is whether financial institutions are collapse. Otherwise, monetary policy we just forget it. Well, designing a monetary policy to keep financial institutions safe in all possible conditions and nothing else, I think will be probably the best conceivable way of generating hyperinflation. Let's call it Argentine economics. So so I think it's pretty clear we end up with a dual mandate for the central bank. And that creates some really big problems on how you relate monetary policy to financial policy. And I've been worried about that relationship in the Bank of England now, and what tools you have and how effective the tools are for managing financial stability if monetary policy is not only targeted at financial stability, which I think it can't be. So I would say we live in a complicated world. We do have at least two major objectives. We have one dominant policy instrument, have had to find others, and we have to pray that they are used sufficiently intelligently and sensitively by the people in charge that they don't crash into each other in extreme conditions. And I would never be confident that we can do it. But the simple, horrible truth is the world is a difficult one. My final point, of course, goes back to my book. The reason we have this problem is that the banking system is a walking disaster, and as long as we have a financial system which is dominated by institutions this leveraged, we're going to go on with having this problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we may come back to some of that area later on, but when we talk about the banks, whether it's doing too much or too little. But let's move on to this other area, which you did touch on a bit, Martin, but the price stability framework. So, yes, the price stability framework. Should the Bank of England's target be reviewed, and the impact of QE? So, George, just kick us off with some.
So I'll try and keep this, because this was touched on in the panel before we broke for lunch, and I think there's probably a lot on here to people to discuss, both from Kate and Martin. So we obviously heard a lot of views on the merits of inflation targeting, or rather the existing form. Several witnesses said they thought it worked well. Two quotes, the 2% target was a reasonable level that would satisfy Greenspan's definition of inflation, which was that people would not notice it. Another one, the very clear target of 2% inflation helps anchor the discussions and the scrutiny. That said, as we well know, and we've been discussing, some highlighted the complications arising when interest rates approach their zero lower bound, and some felt specifically that the pursuit of symmetric inflation targets can bring about conflicts between the bank's objectives of ensuring price stability and financial stability. So we did indeed hear a case for reviewing the target, and some suggested, like Kevin Walsh, he suggested target ranges. He said, I tend to prefer ranges versus point estimates. Precision is what led many of the central banks to overly stimulate economies a few years ago. So there were a number of ways in which people suggested it might be reviewed and what that may lead to. But, and the big but is pretty obvious, many witnesses, and this was touched upon just before lunch, many witnesses were unable to identify how this is to be done and when to do it without seriously undermining market expectations and compromising the bank's ability to remain credible. So there was a general sense, an overwhelming sense, that if you're going to do it, you should not do it now. I don't know, should we stop there?
Let's stop there. Let's bring Kate in. On, what's your overall thoughts on whether the 2% is still appropriate?
Well, I think we need a lot of things in the framework as originally set up work incredibly well. But one of the things that can be a bit frustrating when you're actually at the bank or on the policy committee is because the Treasury very properly sets the target, the bank actually kind of can't comment on it. You have to sort of, well, not in public anyway, you have to take what's given to you. And there was a lot of disquiet about that, actually. Martin referred to the change of target from RPI to CPI. I think it was a good change in the end, but I think it led to some difficulties. But there was some concern about that change of the target, partly because, of course, CPI doesn't say anything very much about housing costs. Now, I could talk for another 3 hours about why it's very difficult to put housing costs into a price index, but actually not having it in at all was something that people worried about. I am with the people on the panel who think there is a case for raising the target to 3%, but I'm completely also with, and this is a point Silvana made, which is that actually doing it when other central banks haven't done it does lead you to some problems. And the real difficulty with changing it is whenever it's proposed, everybody always says, it's a good idea, but we can't do it now. And it's because I think I can agree with you, George, it would be a bad idea to do it now. When the circumstances are in which it would be a good idea, are much, much harder to come about. So I'm also very sympathetic to the point that Kevin Walsh put about having a range. It wasn't clear to me in the period, if you go back to 2014-16, when CPI ran clearly below target, that we were actually in a problem where we had a failure of monetary policy. The second thing I'd say about the framework, it's just different from the target, is something about the way in which the bank works with the framework. The inflation target is defined as something that's supposed to operate at all times. And because of the well-known lags in the operation of a change in interest rates or change in inflation, this means that the bank has tended to operate, not exclusively, but tended to operate by saying, well, we'll set interest rates with a view to getting inflation back to target at around the 2-year mark. But I think the problem with that is it can lead to imbalances in the economy, particularly actually resulting from the financial sector, which build up quite slowly, simply being missed or underestimated because they will operate after the 2-year mark. I still think that was a problem we faced in the run-up to the financial crisis. We did occasionally, I was on the committee at the time, talk about the potential for risk coming in from that, but we didn't really do anything about it. And I think there's also perhaps a case for pushing rates up a bit more after the global financial crisis because of thinking about some of the long-term imbalances you may be building up from keeping rates so low for so long. So generally, I think it's quite hard to move away from 2%. I think I gently disagree with something. You didn't endorse this, George. You're rightly not endorsing anything. The point about people ignoring inflation, 2% is still 2%. Over a period of 10 years, this isn't quite a big shift in the, this is quite a big shift in the price level. I sometimes felt that when inflation was close to 2%, that people ignored it actually too much. One of the things that I found really interesting over the past 18 months, interesting although painful, is that people have started to think again about what does inflation mean. And I'm saying this partly because I spend most of my life now involved in pensions, and thinking about what inflation means to pensioners is something I pass a great deal of time on, and just because it was only 2% didn't mean if you lived for 20 years you could ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Well, lots of food for thought there. So let's turn it out to the audience. Is there anyone who wants to make a point or ask a question? Is there anyone who wants to make the full-throated argument for the 2% target to be raised? If you put your hand up and we will go to you. I'm sure there must be someone who has an opinion on whether the bank's inflation target is going to be at the right rate.
Tony.
Gentleman over there, Tony Yates.
I doubt many people will be surprised to hear me volunteer to make this argument, but it strikes me that if 2% was the right number in 92, 97, target was pretty much the same during that period. It can't be the right number now, given what we've learnt about the size of shocks that can hit us, the propensity, therefore, for interest rates to hit their floor, the inefficacy of the alternative instruments, and the difficulties of getting monetary and fiscal policy coordination. Mm-hmm. So, 4.
Martin, coming on that.
Well, because I basically agree with what Kate said, but there are two issues here, and that was the one. I mean, this is Olivier Blanchard's argument and others. I mean, essentially what we have learned is sometimes we need really quite seriously negative real rates, or some think we need them. Others think they should never be negative, and if it happens, everybody responsible should be shocked. But leave that aside. Some of us think we sometimes need it, and if 2% is your target and mostly achieve it, the room you have is limited. And we go on. That's why we ended up with QE, which is very, very controversial. So it would be better to have 4, which was recommended. The problem, and I'm sympathetic to that view, the problem is, when do you change it? And I've argued very strongly that one wouldn't want to change when one is at 8. Because that sort of sounds like you're just giving up, doesn't it? So you want to go to 4 when you've got to 2, but when we've got to 2, no one will want to do it. But but I do see the logical argument for that. The second one is the range. I do think, and I didn't think this before during the 2010s, the effort that was made, that wasn't so big an issue here, but it was a big issue in the Eurozone and the US to get inflation up to 2, probably, arguably, had some financial consequences. I think the people who think the QE has basically ended civilization as we know it are nuts. But nonetheless, there is an argument that working so hard with 0 rates and QE to get inflation up from 1 to 2 might actually be more trouble than it's worth and cause more trouble than it's worth. And I think it's something we need to look at. And that would imply that we would say that central bank's doing pretty well if it's within the range of 1 to 3, say. And I think that's worth considering, and I wouldn't be against that at all.
Yeah, to some extent, doesn't the urgency...
And to some extent, by the way, it's what they're doing.
Yes.
Be fair, that is in fact what they're doing. They're not saying we're going to hit 2% every second, because that would be mad.
But the urgency of the question to be considered, doesn't that to some extent depend on how likely you think it is, or one thinks it is, that we'll be back at the zero lower bound? So what's the neutral real rate of interest going forward? Some people think that we're out of that.
I think, to my mind, I give subjective probabilities to things. The subjective probability is certainly 1 in 5, and could well be higher. So yeah, I think when I look at the world economy now, I can perfectly well imagine being back at the zero bound by 2030.
Yeah, Kate, you're nodding at that. Do you share that?
I would agree that I'm generally surprised in this panel to discover how much I agree with Martin about things, but I really
Shock,
agree.
isn't it?
It's very surprising. It makes a panel dull, actually. They should try and disagree
I'll work
more.
harder to disagree.
But I agree with that. We may well have a shock, which should bring us back to the lower bound. And I think Tony's arguments, which I'm of course familiar with, for why we need to create more space are very cogent. And I do worry that two is not enough. But in some sense, if it's not enough here, it's not enough in other countries. So I think we're trying to make this argument more generally. It's not just about the UK.
Of course.
We have to make this up. We have
Clearly.
to try and carry this argument worldwide. So there's a lot to do.
So
not much work was, when we got to 2, it was hard, globally, it was hardly a very scientific process.
No. It was following New Zealand, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
My friend Don Brash is a great guy, was a great guy, but the real reason why I should have set the inflation target for the world, and nobody planned it.
Well, considering we've got some agreement on the panel, is anyone who likes to disagree that it would be argue it would be a terrible mistake to change the target, or any other points they'd like to make on this question of the target? If you, Jagjit, let's have microphone coming over.
Thank you very much, and also what a great conference. 2 things. Don't even think about changing the inflation to 2% is absolutely fine. It's consistent with price stability. Prices are going to be doubling every 35 years. That's just fine. Don't even think about it. We can go into details later on if we need to. But I'd be interested in what the panel think about the Prime Minister or the government imposing or suggesting another target and saying that it was planning to halve inflation over the course of this year. Do they think that was a wise thing for the Prime Minister or government to do? It seemed to me to be complicating the process at a very difficult time, and saying we're going to perhaps even interfere with the process. It seemed to me, going back to the first point, something that was not fully respectful of independence in the way that I would have wanted it to be.
Well, as the politician on the panel, George, do you have a thought?
It's a very, very good point, and I think it does raise questions, as you rightly say. But rule 1 in politics is you generally try not to set targets on your own terms without knowing you're going to meet them. So he clearly thought that he was sort of on a winning streak. But I think it is a very he could obviously justify it by saying there are other tools at my disposal and the Bank of England's independent and But I think you're right. It's interesting though. I maybe missed it. I didn't see there being widespread sense in the media of saying, is this questioning bank independence? And I think that maybe the lack of that response comes back to the first point that we've been discussing here, which is actually, is there enough understanding in Parliament about operational independence, et cetera, But I'm interested in what others think.
I was unhappy that the Prime Minister made that statement because of the role of the Bank of England. Coming back again to your question, which is a very good one, it hardly adds to public understanding if the Prime Minister takes on the power to do it. And actually, even for Andrew Bailey to have said it, despite the fact he's supposed to do it, it's quite a tall order because he, like Rishi Sunak, has no idea about the shocks that are going to come along. A lot of play was made quite rightly in the previous panel about the fact that all our forecasts are conditional. And when you make an unconditional pledge, you're not really the person supposed to be delivering it. I think that's a bit problematic.
Yeah.
My feeling was, I thought it was rather funny actually, but my view is that I view the Prime Minister, what the Prime Minister was doing is he was decided to join the vast army of forecasters since he clearly had no control over it, and he certainly knew he had no control over it. And I'm surprised that anyone who I believe worked at Goldman Sachs and should ever have believed that the fate of the inflation forecaster was likely to go well.
You make an interesting point, though, George, about the media's
Including the
response.
Bank of England, of course.
Because at the time, I remember the main critique was that he'd set himself too easy in a task. Everyone thought that inflation was going to halve. He was just basically saying it would follow the path of the Bank of England and the OBR's forecasts, and he was going to try and take credit for something that was going to happen anyway. It wasn't perceived as him saying he was going to deliver it, rightly or wrongly. But
yeah, I think that what Kate was saying is absolutely right. It doesn't, though, add to the understanding of operational independence and how things work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our next session, our next topic, which is the bank's role and remit, and the question of whether it's doing too much. I mean, there's been quite a lot of criticism about taking on questions of climate change and other things as well. So, George, kick us off.
I'll cut straight to the chase. The evidence we received was very much along the lines of yes, the answer to that question. I've got the remit letters here, especially the FPC one, and you just have to go through it and the number of considers and have regards to, et cetera, et cetera. And as you say, it's climate change, competitiveness of the financial sector, first-time buyers, etc., and so on and so forth. Chris Giles, I don't know if you're still here, was pretty tough on it, saying that quite a lot of the additional text that's been added is simply flab. John Vickers actually had a very good line. He said, I like the Crick and Watson test. Their paper explaining the structure of DNA is fewer than 900 words. It ought to be possible to explain the remit of the Bank of England committee in no less succinctly. Which is actually not what the letters are, quite considerably over that. Now, why does this matter? Witnesses told us about the time, and it's interesting, Kate, what you said, you will definitely want to come in on this, the time taken to fulfill these objectives, the administration required to support them, the opportunity cost that could be time spent on other things, and above all, the sense that a number of these points could be distractions from the primary role. And John Vickers argued the expansion of the remit, quote, dilutes the sense that they're focused on inflation control. Just if I may, just to expand on this, a number of witnesses also considered that the government elected politicians are better placed to fulfill many of the objectives assigned to the bank. Interestingly, Ed Balls, quote, the idea you start to throw into the mix other secondary objectives which are not really directly affected by this, but sensibly by the instruments that the bank has in front of it concerns me. I stress that concept of the instruments that the bank has in front of it. And he went on and he said the government should be clear that tackling climate change is a matter for government, and that, and I quote, to start expecting the bank to lead on that does not seem to me to make any sense. Then just going on, there was a sense that therefore the government could be outsourcing challenges it confronts. And some, and I'm not going to overplay this, some witnesses told us that they were concerned that extended remits risks, drawing the bank into the government's broader political agenda. And that also there is a sense that the more you put in new objectives and have regards to, you get conflicts within the actual letter. Sorry, I'm going to go on because I want to give credence, some space to what David Roberts, Chair of the Court, told us. And I think this is interesting. He said, organisations work at their best when they have clarity and simplicity of objectives and goals. And Andrew Bailey said, when we asked him about the expansion of the remit, he said, and I quote, it makes policy making more complicated. On that, I will stop.
Okay, well, Martin, let's hear your response to that. Too many barnacles on the Bank of England's remit boat for you? I
thought everything that has been just quoted is so obviously right. And I have been written a little bit about this and talked about it. So it seems to me obvious. The Bank of England's goals are monetary and financial stability. That's difficult enough, and there are trade-offs there. It has instruments which are credibly both necessary and sufficient to achieve those objectives, so we've had some difficulties. The idea that it can sensibly be asked to add in several other objectives just because the politicians are too cowardly and incompetent to deal with them themselves is really frightening, and I'll come to that in a second, and irresponsible. And And so we should defend the focus of the Bank of England. And if the government wants other things to be done, there are other ways of doing it. I'd like to make a more general point, which is actually fits in this context, and it's in my recent book on democracy, and Paul Tucker has written a great deal about it in his recent works. And it's incredibly important, which is essentially philosophy of government. How do we run ourselves well? Well, it's pretty obvious we're not running ourselves, it seems to me, terribly well at the moment. And one of the issues is how you delegate responsibility from politicians. And the Bank of England actually works quite well, so it's in some sense a sort of model. You can give independent agencies substantial powers delegated from government if the remit is clear, it's accountable, the people who are to be held accountable are known, and there is an effective way of holding them accountable. And in this way, we can improve government without in any fundamental way undermining democracy. If you give fundamental responsibilities to such bodies in a way that is inherently confused and confusing and quite possibly internally contradictory, in which deeply political judgments have to be made then by these bodies, they will inevitably become completely politicized. And in the process of becoming completely politicized, their reputations and independence will be compromised, and government will be done not only in an undemocratic way, but in a very bad way. So I think the issue of maintaining the clarity and coherence of the bank's objectives anchored in what it is able to do and can be judged for doing is not merely incredibly important for the Bank of England, it's basically a model of how one wants to govern properly in a complicated world where we need independent institutions. And it's very important to note, though this has not yet happened, that where we go away from that, you can end up in the sort of disastrous mess the Americans are now getting into, in which basically no independent institution, even the FBI, for example, is actually depoliticized. So the principle here is, I think, a very big one, and the Bank of England is a perfect example of where it's working quite well at the moment and must be defended.
Well, very good. Well, that's very trenchant. And when it comes to climate change, I can't help wishing that Mark Carney was here, because he was a great champion of taking climate change risks into the bank's remit.
Let me be clear. It is completely legitimate for the Bank of England to make sure that financial risks or monetary policy risks that are relevant to their job are taken into account. There's no problem with saying, well, are banks, for example, so exposed to major climate risks which they are not aware of, such that might undermine their stability and therefore financial stability. That's a completely legitimate function of the Bank of England. Managing the climate policy and investments of the country is not.
Very good. All right, well, let's open it to questions. If you want to weigh in on this question or related ones, please put your hand up. Is anyone? Lady at the back there. Should be mic coming to you.
Hi, is it working?
Yep, we can hear you.
Catherine Nice of PGIM Fixed Income. I've got a question for the panel. One thing we haven't talked about is profit distribution rules. This seems to be getting a lot of attention in Europe, here in the UK, perhaps less so in the US and other DM economies. But that is one new area where it looks like monetary policy making is becoming very politicized. So I'd just be interested in the views on the panel around how should we structure profit distribution rules in a way that doesn't undermine the role of the central bank and the public can understand.
Sorry, is this the greedflation issue when you say profit distributions, or just general inequality?
So this is around losses that central banks are making now on the back of having done QE, and from a consolidated government budget perspective, the differences in these rules don't really make sense, don't matter, but it does seem to matter to some people who are looking at it. and it's becoming more of an issue in Europe and in the UK.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think
this is the profitability of the central bank or the distribution of profits and wages in the economy? I'm not quite clear.
I mean, my understanding is the UK government, the Treasury, is transferring money to the Bank of England to make itself whole for the accounting losses as a result of the QE that it's done and the change in bond yields to that. But Kate, do you want to come in on this quite technical question? But
very key.
I'm slightly reluctant to come on this quite technical question, partly because I'm afraid I simply haven't thought about this before. But I don't feel this very. I have to say, I don't feel this very strongly as a distributional issue. I mean, it raises all sorts of questions, which actually there's a lot of evidence given to George's panel on, about QE and whether it was continued for too long, and therefore that's partly why we've run ourselves into this problem with such very big losses. But undoubtedly, this is really part of a distribution in a way within the government itself. I don't strongly feel it as a distributional issue for the UK as a whole. The losses have been made in some sense within the public sector. Somebody is going to have to sort that out. I'd like to say something, however, since generally I'm invited, the first respondent is invited to go back to the topic. I was a bit surprised I thought people in your evidence sessions made rather heavy weather of this question of the remits. I think it's more true on the financial stability remit, which is quite lengthy and confused. I read the monetary remit, which was certainly longer than the remit letters I remember getting. But at the end of it, there's a whole list of things reminding you what government policy was. I didn't feel it particularly invited you to do anything about it. But it did remind me that while I was on the MPC, there were two things that people talked about. One was that they were always worried about whether we were paying enough attention to issues in different parts of the country. This really led on from the famous remark that Eddie George made about unemployment in Newcastle being a price worth paying, which is kind of rather difficult. And actually, you cannot respond as a monetary policy maker to different issues around the country, and we were very strong in saying so. The other trouble is because we were seen as relatively successful, if you're seen as being successful in doing something, which in this case was inflation control, people always think you might like to do something else as well, kind of on the side, because you appear to be competent. So people thought we ought to also manage the housing market, which we clearly hadn't got the tools to do. I can remember being rather startled when people said we'd lost control of the housing market, because we'd never thought we'd had control of the housing market. Quite difficult to lose. So I think I agree with the general point that you should not give the bank too many objectives, not actually because it spends much time on them, but because it's possible that then it may become subject to political criticism. I felt that a little bit in the summer last year. I think it is much better, as others have said, to keep it relatively simple. I disagree slightly with something that was said, however, about climate change. I mean, climate change, clearly, whether we like it or not, is the most amazing and difficult challenge of our time. And I did think, given that other people are asked to do it, that for the bank to think about its corporate bonds in that respect, whether it should have had corporate bonds or not, is of course a different question. I did think actually it was a good idea for the bank to think about what it did with its corporate bonds in that respect, simply in the case that the rest of us who hold lots of assets are asked to do that, and I didn't see why the bank should be exempt.
That's an interesting point. Is there any other questions or points people would like to make about this remit question before we move on? Gentleman there, right, the mic should be on its way to you.
Thanks. John Whittaker, Lancaster University. Just wanted to add a comment in regard to the question from the back here on the remit, on the transmission of cash to the Bank of England from the Treasury to make up for their losses. There's a contrast here with the Fed in the United States, where the Fed has been making similar losses, basically because it's holding government debt, which has fallen in value as interest rates have risen. And the Fed kind of magics this away by saying, oh, we don't actually have to take account for this because we can just add something on the asset side of the portfolio to account for the fact that we're going to make lots of profits in the future from future currency issue, and therefore we don't have to bother about it. it. And frankly, I'm just making a comment really to try and cement the point here that it doesn't matter, except possibly from a reputational point of view. So maybe the Bank of England should do something similar, a kind of magic it away, and we wouldn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, and the argument in the UK context is that if 10 billion is going to the Bank of England from the government, that's 10 billion the government can't spend, which it could spend on public services. Martin, do you buy that?
No. Well, I mean, my view is we haven't discussed, and there are very big questions about QE and whether, in some ways, the ability of the central bank to use QE should be constrained in its remit. That's quite an interesting discussion. I have lots of friends who think that QE is pretty well the most evil policy ever been used by a central bank. You can see, and everybody involved should be shot, and so presumably they would say that this should be ruled out. I think that's completely impossible. It's a completely standard instrument of monetary policy, has been for a very, very long time. But it's an issue to discuss, because it's going to go on being discussed, particularly now that we are on the other side of the story with higher interest rates. And that leads me to the second point. Should central bank, and this is a fascinating debate now out there on which I have very strong views, so I'll express them, which is that the solvency of a central bank within the state is a matter of absolutely zero significance. So it doesn't affect in any way its ability to do what it's there to do, which is to ensure the stability of the money supply. The solvency of the state is an issue, since we actually pay absolutely no attention in general to whether our state is solvent in any of our discussion of fiscal policy, and all respectable British people, including most recently the IFS, think that's perfectly reasonable. Why should we worry about the solvency of the central bank as a little bit of this is beyond me.
I think in practical terms, it comes down to this question of whether you should pay money on banks' reserves at the current rate, isn't it, in terms of...
Well, that's, to me, there is an interesting question on whether interest should be paid on reserves. And it really comes down to the question of how you want to tax banks. And it gets to reserve management. This is quite a technical issue, but I perfectly well understand that from a central bank's point of view in the modern world, paying interest on reserves is a relatively convenient way of managing monetary policy in a world of excess reserves, and indeed more broadly, and managing monetary transmission. And that being the case, telling them that they can't pay money on reserves, that means immediately you'd have to start thinking about how you manage reserve requirements, and it becomes a big mess. So I would strongly recommend leaving that one alone.
Okay. George?
Just a quick question to you, Martin, then. On this point about the accountability of the bank and using QE in the future, I mean, I've got the MPC remit letter here, and it says, the Chancellor says that I expect the committee to work with the government to ensure the appropriate governance arrangements are in place to ensure accountability in the deployment of such instruments. So that sort of stricture is there. What would you want to have more, or what, and looking back, what would you have liked to have had when we saw the big bouts of QE during COVID, for example?
Well, I suppose, given that the Treasury was on the hook, the Treasury might have said, while you're doing this, would you send us a letter every year or so describing what you think the longer run implications of this might be for the public finances, for the economy, and for the solvency of the state. That would not seem to me at all unreasonable. You explain why you're doing and analyze and articulate the broader implications. Now, I know there are people here who are actually deeply involved in this. My memory is that wasn't done, but because the focus was overwhelmingly on the effects of QE on monetary policy, monetary transmission, and the economy, and that clearly had to be the overwhelmingly dominant focus. But maybe one could say, if you're doing something that's a bit unconventional, you should go out of your way to explain in detail how that might affect you, the bank, in the future. I imagine somebody is now immediately going to jump up and say, actually, this is all covered in our reports. Look at Annex 3 subsect, and I don't know.
Okay, well, let's move on to our fourth tranche of discussion, which is diversity of thought and governance at the Bank of England, with questions about whether the money supply has been neglected because there's not enough monetarists on the MPC, sources of internal challenge within the bank, which goes to the question of whether the external members have enough resources. George, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts about what you heard?
Sure. So sort of golden thread running through this is there sufficient challenge, I suppose, in different guises, culture, diversity of thought, governance process, and also through the lens of the last few years and the bank's performance. As you mentioned, the sense we got from a number of witnesses was that there wasn't sufficient challenge on the MPC, to the view that higher inflation would be transitory. Why? It was felt that by a number of people, that there wasn't a sufficient diversity of thought. Many members of the MPC and senior officials in the bank have similar backgrounds, qualifications, and also a sense that their professional careers largely have been dominated by a sense that inflation was dormant. Now, I want to put a massive caveat on what I've just said. I think almost every witness who said that also said, but that was also the case in other major central banks. And I think it's very important. I know Phil would like to sort of get into the blame game here. I think that actually what we now need to be doing is sort of taking a step back and saying, what are the constructive lessons that we need to learn from the last few years? So moving on to that, there was quite a lot of questioning as to whether the bank was or whether had paid enough attention to money supply figures, in particular M4 growth. And I should stress again, this wasn't necessarily a sense from witnesses that there need to be monetarists on the MPC. Rather, it was a question, I think it was raised earlier in the earlier panel, whether there was enough people around the table saying, are we looking at the right things in the right way? Stephen King, for example, the chief economist at HSBC, said money supply was ignored in a rather foolish fashion. Then that diversity of thought, or lack of it, sort of fed into 3 points. Forecasting, that you all know, Ben Bernanke is running the inquiry on that. The forecasting came in for a lot of criticism, not least from you, Martin. Again, I'm going to quote Stephen King. He said, it sounds like an Alice in Wonderland argument. The bank is simply saying, we have a 2%, we have a target of 2%, we forecast it will be at 2%. There is nothing that is going to happen in the near term that will change that. So there was that. And then, and we can come on to talk about those forecasting models, again, the prevalence of them in other banks, central banks, is something that one shouldn't ignore. Second, related to that, is appointments, because obviously, as the governor himself said, this is not a sausage machine. This is not something that people just take the outputs of various models and says we accept them. There is a debate, obvious discussion, as you all know. But this brings us back to the sense that there is a dominance from a number of witnesses said, the dominance of former Treasury officials. No disrespect to Treasury officials, by the way, very able people. But some said, is that dominance too strong? Tim Congdon, for example, quote, the real problem here is that the Treasury is too powerful. It dominates and controls the appointments process. Final point, and then I'll shut up, is whether the court is, what role is the court playing, and is it playing a role of internal challenge sufficiently? And here, of course, you have to be careful that you're not getting a body internally that is second-guessing policy decisions. And I have to say here that, as you mentioned right at the start, I was the minister who pushed through the abolition of the Oversight Committee. And it was interesting for me to hear people questioning, therefore, whether that was the right move. Sir Howard Davies, he said the court looks like a hygiene body. It's not useless, but it doesn't do very much. And Roger Bootle, there's a problem with the court. It's so heavily stuffed with executives of the bank that it is almost marking its own homework. So there's a question there, but I think also a very real cognizance of the fact that you have to be careful about getting a sense of challenge and where that oversteps the mark. Final word goes to David Roberts, the chair of court at the moment. He said, in terms of both statutory responsibilities and the remit that the court fulfills, our ability to influence and execute change is high. So that's his view. So,
Okay. Well, Kate, there's so much to get into there, and as the longest-serving external MPC member, I'm sure you've got thoughts on all of that. So let us know them.
Well, longest serving is also a long time ago, and since I left the committee, I have often been asked by the Treasury to take part in the appointments panel, and indeed, Phil Aldrich, I don't know if Phil's still here, he was here this morning, once wrote that it was my fault that there was no diversity of thought because I'd appointed so many external MPC members, although, and I can see actually several people in this room who I was involved in appointing, and all I can say is that anybody who thinks that Catherine Mann is like Swati Dhingra or that Jan Vlieger is like Ian McCafferty hasn't really met any of them. So my view is that there is a lot of diversity of thought, and I've thought a lot because I've been on the panel about what are you doing when you're appointing people. So what do? We think as you would, what are the strengths of the people who are on the panel today? Where do we think there might be gaps? Where do we think somebody could come along and usefully add to the panel? And that's your sort of first question. And then when you actually come to interview people, of course, what are you looking for? You're looking for the way in which they would approach the job. And I'm thinking here of strength of character, ability to give challenge, ability to listen to other people, by the way, which I thought was incredibly important. I see the committee as one which should learn from each other. One of the things that I am disappointed about in the proposal to have the transcripts published is we did sit and listen to each other when I was on the panel and change our minds according to what other people said. I think that's much less likely if you are publishing the work. And I've come under criticism, actually, from some people in this room, about the nature of the appointments. People feel we haven't necessarily appointed enough, really strong monetary academics. And I think that's a very serious point. It's one of the things that the people who are going to do appointments in the future, of which I will not be one, should really think about. So I'm not at all of the view, as a matter of fact, that there is a sort of dominant body of thought. I didn't come from a background very similar to the other people. When I was on the panel, I'd spent 9 years working in industry. I'd not worked in a financial institution at all, and I'd not been an academic economist. In that sense, I was completely different. I think when you get onto the forecasting and the role of the model, this is actually, however, more difficult. It's pretty difficult it would be quite difficult to run a process in which 9 people all had exactly their own model. So you've got to reach some kind of compromise. Now, but having the model can then exert a sort of uncomfortable discipline, because there's a kind of tacit view that if you were going to disagree from the general view about prospects and disagree about what you want to do with interest rates, it had to be rooted in some disagreement sort of about model or about the inputs to the model. And for example, perfectly well disagree about the weight that was given to monetary aggregates. And just as a matter of fact, people did disagree about this when I was on the panel. But it's important to think that the model, when you run it, it's only a starter to thought for the committee. It helps them to think things through, and it helps them to have some consistency in their view. That's what models do for you. It's never something where you turn the handle and get the answer. But the key thing which we did miss for some of the time when I was on the panel, and I don't know what it's like now, is that the model needs to be comprehensible to the MPC, and it needs to be rooted in the right combination of something that's very theoretical and something that's actually been taken to the data. Now, those of you who haven't been involved in modelling may think, well, this is kind of obvious, but it's much harder than it sounds. And during my time, we operated for a while with a very theory-based model, which frankly I found too much of a black box. It's hard to work out what came out of it. But you can't, on the other hand, throw theory away. So I think sub-models to look at specific questions, which we did use, can be very illuminating and really help the MPC's judgments. I did think one thing that came out of the evidence I read was Kevin Walsh made a point that I did agree with, which is, do MPC members spend enough time sitting together, thrashing out the big topics that you face? And actually, I don't think we often did, because the pressure of timetable, particularly on the internal members of the bank, is very great. They spend a lot of their time in meetings. They're all on 3 panels, which external MPC members aren't. And perhaps there wasn't enough time for people to sit as a committee and chuck around ideas relatively informally on some of the big topics that are being faced.
Fascinating. Well, I'm sure there's no shortage of opinions in this room on these topics of diversity and of thought and governance and experience as well. So if you want to come in, gentleman there on the right. Mic on its way.
Thomas Viladek from T. Rowe Price. So thanks so much for these comments. They're very helpful. I was wondering, what are the panelists' views on what things have turned out differently if there was more external than internal members on the MPC? Because that could sort of shift the dynamics of power a little bit, I suppose. And there are countries around the world where the majority of the MPC are external members, not members internal to the central bank.
Interesting. Martin, do you want to pick that one up? More external members, is that a progressive move?
I don't think I have very strong views on that, except in the following way. I was going to make another point, which where I'm... When you were there, was the FPC already established when you were there? It seems to me that we didn't really think through, but I've not been in it, so I'm looking at it outside, the implications of the two remits and the two committees. And that does relate, I think, to your question in one important way, which is that the insiders are the people on both. And when I think now, in the current world of how you think about monetary and financial policy, it seems to me sort of obvious a priori, though I don't know how it works in practice, that you really can't think about one without the other, because the financial system is the transmission mechanism, and if you don't really understand what you're trying to do and how the financial system works, you're not going to be really very good at understanding how the monetary policy is going to work. And that's particularly true in times of stress. So it seemed to me sort of logical they're going to have to coordinate quite closely, but the only people who are going to dominate that are inevitably the insiders. And so I feel that the people, independent people who are different on the FPC and the MPC, are going to be a little bit out of the sort of central loop here. Now, that may not be a problem, but it's something that I've been sort of increasingly thinking, well, it may be. And this is a different system from what we had before. And I haven't seen, don't know how much you're going to cover this, because I didn't look at, I haven't seen really careful ex post analysis of how that is working. But it is a different system from what was planned, and it happened by accident. On the other issues, I'm inclined to think from the discussions I have that independent members of the Monetary Policy Committee need more dedicated resources of their own. That must make it easier for them to challenge the insiders, though some of them are quite good at challenging the insiders anyway. But I think I understand now they have 2 researchers of their own each. That doesn't sound enough to me. I'm rather tempted by the idea of following, which really pushes you further into following the Fed with actually independent forecasts. So you have a range of independent forecasts instead of pretending you all converge on one. I know that would create problems, but it seems to me really quite attractive. I think it's magnificent that we've appointed so many foreigners, and there was a stage in which I won't perhaps in public mention when I thought the obvious next governor of the Bank of England was a European who was going to be available. I'll leave it to you all to decide who that might have been. But I think that's magnificent. I think the idea that we should have outsiders who are experienced of other countries, Americans, for example, who look at it in a different way and don't take for granted that the way we do things must be right. I think that's a very good thing. And I think it would be quite good if we could get a few more cranks. Cranks are incredibly helpful. So having somebody on the MPC, but just one person who did think that QE is the end of all civilization, and said every time, but what's going to happen when it ends? And interest rates have to go up to 7%. How does that play out? You need people like that in committees. They don't have to be the majority. Who those people should be, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Kate, you wanted to come in?
I did. I really want to come in on the question of the two committees, where in the past I've sometimes said I thought it shouldn't be 2 committees, it should be 1 committee for the reason you gave, that it gives so much. Instinct. It gives so much to the. I've become less sure about that because of the range of expertise you need between those 2 committees. But what you certainly do is equality of information. And I say this because in the run-up to, in the early stages of the financial crisis, when I was on the Monetary Policy Committee, I often felt that the external members of the committee had less information about the financial system than the internal members. I felt that wasn't right. So I think it's very important that the external members of the Monetary Policy Committee can see all the information that goes to the FPC so that, if relevant, they can play it into their thinking.
It's obviously right. If the collapse of your financial system is going to dictate zero rates, whatever,
Yes.
the MPC needs to be fully aware of why that might be happening.
Good if someone tells you.
And not just through the governor or the other internal members conveying that information.
They need to understand all the things that are relevant to monetary policy, and for sure what's happening to the financial system, there's no debate about that anymore, affects what you want to do with monetary policy.
Okay. We've got time for another question on this. Does anyone agree with Martin that we need more cranks? Jan Diego, let's have your view on this.
So I was just going to make a point about this 5-4 thing, which comes up frequently, and as having been one of the four, I think maybe an even keener central bank watcher will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think we've never had a 5-4 internal-external vote. And if it was indeed the case that the internals are, frequently, subject to groupthink, and then it's a damn shame that the externals can't challenge them, then we would have seen quite a few 5-4 votes, and that, with maybe one or two exceptions, I don't think that's ever happened. So I really don't think it's a problem. I think the prospect of having a 5-4 split is enough of a discipline to do exactly what Martin says, is for people to listen very seriously to these challenges to the point where they end up changing their mind. And so you don't see the 5-4 split.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very interesting point. Silvana as well.
No, just to reassure people that the MPC members are routinely briefed on what's going on in the FPC and vice versa. So it's not that they're flying blind. And yeah.
It's not a question of briefing, Silvana. It's a question of being able to see all the information they see. I know you get briefed. It's a question of having full access to the information. I'm not sure whether you have that. Perhaps you haven't wanted it.
Obviously, you cannot see it all because there's a time constraint, and most externals have other responsibilities outside the bank, and that's what they're bringing to the committee. So, but I think there is a fairly thorough briefing, and I don't think there are relevant gaps for the MPC or the FPC for that matter. And in terms of obviously, in terms of responsibilities, the FPC is mostly focused on tail events, and whereas the MPC is more focused on the modal, what's the most likely scenario. But there are times in which these overlap, as we've seen in the last 3 years, and that's where the flow of information becomes even heavier or more relevant.
Right. Well, I think that exchange just demonstrated the value of this forum, where we can actually get into the real detail of these questions. But we need to move on to our fifth tranche of discussion, which is accountability. George, the role of Parliament and the Internal Evaluation Office, is that enough? What have your committee heard on this?
So, statements of the running office here. This is, in a sense, the elephant in the room. It's the age-old problem. How do you get, and Martin, you were touching on this, how do you get the balance right between independence and accountability and scrutiny? How do you make sure that the accountability isn't so great it's imperiling independence? How do you make sure independence isn't so great there's no accountability? And you had some very good points on that. And then second, where you do have bodies that are scrutinising an independent entity, who guards the guards? Just starting off with the first point on accountability. Conferences like this, as I said, I congratulate everyone here, the organisers, because we need a lot more, in my view, accountability and scrutiny, and it was perfectly clear, for reasons I'll come on to, why. Obviously, though, that said, we shouldn't underestimate the amount of scrutiny that the bank is under, and the media, Parliament itself. There is a lot of scrutiny. And the TSC, as I said, does a very good job, and the bank actually is incredibly good at coming to Parliament to explain itself. I think that the evidence that we received, though, increasingly focused back on the very first point that we discussed or was raised, which is about the expansion of the bank's powers and remit, and what it is now getting involved in, whether Parliament is fully aware of that. It also touched a bit on what you were talking about, Martin, which is the impact of the expansion of the bank's balance sheet, and when you put all that together, I think that there is a sense of whether Parliament is doing enough and is focused enough on how the bank is operating, its independence, operating in terms of its framework and the expansion of that framework and the remit. And I think it's very important that we zero in on when these changes are made, whether there is sufficient scrutiny and debate in Parliament. And Paul Tucker, I've just mentioned, said really important changes to the regime of the bank were made without a great deal of debate. I think that has been somewhat costly. So that is something I think that our committee will certainly be noting. Coming on then to the role of the Independent Evaluation Office and the all-important issue, as I say, of who guards the guards. Now, I don't want to belittle the work, and I'm very interested to know what Kate and others think about the work of the EIO. I certainly don't want to belittle it. It clearly does a very good job in so many ways, but it was drawn to our attention that the IEO is within the bank, manned by former bank staff. One witness put it that the IEO is a little bit too much like the bank marking its own homework. That's not to say we think it's necessarily doing a bad job, but if you're continually marking your own homework, there's a danger that you might mark it up. And Nick McPherson went a stage further. He said that the IEO should probably be strengthened, detached from the bank, and be put into a sort of sphere like the OBR. I think, Martin, I think you might want to talk about this. I think you disagreed. Final word again goes to David Roberts on the IEO. And he said the IEO is, and I quote, always has external advisors and a large external network that it uses because we're all prisoners of our own experience and therefore we need to challenge ourselves. But I end by saying I think that this is, in a sense, out of all these 5 topics, the one that we as parliamentarians are really, really focused on. But over.
Yeah. Well, Martin, let's have your response. Is the bank marking its own homework too much, or is Ben Bernanke being brought in a sign that it can do it?
Well, I thought that's a very interesting appointment, and I'm looking forward to how he approaches it. I think they chose very wisely from their point of view. I'm a great admirer, but it was quite interesting appointment. The general, I don't feel very strongly. I can see arguments both sides on whether the IEO should be like the OBR, independent in that way. It'd be fun for journalists, so we would like it. Maybe not the principal objective. I mean, it is worth noting the Bank of England is not the Treasury. So, for reasons which we've discussed. So we set up the OBR because there was a widely shared view, and I mean, I think it's the thing that George Osborne did, which I most commend him for, because having the Treasury produce the forecasts that were used to justify its own fiscal policies was not a good arrangement, and having an institution that would independently evaluate, even if it's often wrong, was, I think, a major improvement in transparency and fiscal discipline. And I think the experience with a government that lasted 44 days, headed by somebody I can't remember, shows that this was really a useful institution. But the Bank of England isn't the Treasury. It has very clear responsibilities and a mandate. It has to explain to the Chancellor if it's making a mess of it, and it is constantly in front of Parliament. So I'm not clear that you want the IEO to be like the OBR, but I don't feel passionately about it. Otherwise, my own sense is that people are individually accountable. They are hauled in front of parliamentary committees and examined individually. They are, as it were, on the record on this, and they are therefore individually, as far as I can see, individually more accountable to the public and parliamentary institutions than the equivalent members of any other major central bank. So, you know, if you're worried about us, just look at the ECB or the Fed, which are really a mess. So I feel this is an area, perhaps wrongly, in which we're actually doing pretty well.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there's lots of opinions on that. So would anyone like to weigh in on this question? This lady here. Mic to you.
Thanks. Petra Tarat, University of Cambridge. So with respect to central bank accountability, the bank has been having some reviews that have been very limited in scope, but really missing a comprehensive review. To give you an example, I was involved in a comprehensive review of the Central Bank of Chile, covering both its price and financial stability objectives. This was commissioned by the board of the Central Bank of Chile itself, not because they thought there were major things, but because they thought, can we do things better? Yeah? And this was together with Carney Fluke, Don Cohn, Enrique Mendoza, and João Calvo. And so we brought out a report with recommendations, which turned out to be very useful because just as the report came out, the bank actually, Chile hit some major social unrest in the fall of 2019. So how come that the Bank of England has not had such a major review? If it doesn't come from the bank itself, then why not from other people, for instance, the Treasury? Yeah. Following up on that, the Bank of England actually used to have a monetary policy roundtable. So with academics and people from markets, and it used to be twice a year. And then it just became once a year, and now it no longer exists. So it seems that the bank is insufficiently curious about what other people are thinking. Right. So I think there is really scope for great improvement in having better central bank accountability for the Bank of England.
Well, I suppose, George, your report will have that wider view, but Kate, the IEO does tend to focus on discrete topics rather than taking an overall analysis of how the bank is performing, doesn't it? Is that part of the problem?
I'm not sure whether I think it's part of the problem. I think the bigger part, and I think it's been referred to already, is whether or not it's sufficiently external, whether it's bringing enough, as it were, different air into the bank. I would say, however, in favour of the bank, that it's become much more open than it was when if I think about things like Bank Underground, where you see a wider variety of commentary from the staff and much more ease of people in the bank being able to express their views, I think all that has been incredibly useful. To address the question, though, that you asked, the point about the monetary policy roundtable, I think I agree with. I regret the fact that the bank stopped doing that. I don't know why. And I personally think that having a review which is more holistic of the bank might actually get to some of the issues that are being talked about in the way that the reviews of bits of the bank, useful and valuable as they have been, really doesn't. And I don't think any institution shouldn't be afraid of that. In terms of more day-to-day accountability, Martin's made a point that I think I would have made. I have never felt more individually accountable for something I did than I did when I was at the bank, because you are absolutely the only person who goes in and decides how you are going to vote, and people ask you about it afterwards. I can't think of any other role where you're quite as individually picked out. Now, the accountability, of course, I think there are two things about accountability. Nobody would want the kind of accountability where you're second-guessing MPC decisions. Of course, the MPC will get decisions, as it turns out, with hindsight wrong. Any group of people will get things, as it turns out, with hindsight wrong, because you'll get judgments about relationships and the economy wrong. And I don't think that's what anybody really wants to do. What you want to do is ensure that the processes in the bank work properly, that the forecasting is done in a professional way, that everybody is well advised, that the externals have sufficient resource, and all that, and that kind of thing. I'm just talking about monetary policy here, clearly. In terms of accountability to Parliament, we took going to the Treasury Select Committee very seriously when I was at the bank, and we would get our staff to come and ask us questions so that we could practice the answers. And I can truthfully tell you that the questions they asked us were 50 times better than any question I was ever asked by a member of the Treasury Committee, partly because the Treasury Committee was always slightly trying to develop political angles, and that did not necessarily shed really good light on what had led to divisions and debates on the MPC. So I thought that was a problem. You got a better time generally if you went to the Lords. But in my time, when you went to the Lords, they only ever asked the governor questions. I went to the Lords once and was completely silent for 2 hours, and they refused to let anybody except the governor speak.
That wouldn't happen nowadays.
But I'm sure George would be much more broad-minded. Although, this is a rather cheap point, but I'll make it anyway. You had 29 people give you evidence, George. How many of them are women?
It's a very good point. I'd need to check that. Three, right.
Thank you.
Well, we asked, I'm sure lots of people here would have give us evidence. Can I just make up one point that you made, Kate, which I completely agree with? I think that institutions should not be afraid, independent institutions should not be afraid of accountability and scrutiny, as that makes them stronger. I mean, so long as it's the right kind of accountability and scrutiny, it makes them stronger as it builds legitimacy, and it makes sure that you build strength and confidence in the wider public. And I think that that would be my overall sort of prism through which I see this debate. And I agree with a lot of what you say. Also, on the point of scrutiny, I think that the point about the IEO and the OBR, I think a number of witnesses pointed to us saying that the danger is if you empower a body like the OBR, you get a backseat driver. And that is very dangerous because you then really begin to blur who is responsible for what, and you get people trying to second guess, and that is a real, real concern.
Okay. Yeah, I know you want to come in, Martin, but I want to just get another question in. We can get that in, and you can respond to that as well. Chris Giles, because we are coming towards the end.
I'm going to slightly, Chris Giles from the FT. I'm going to slightly disagree with Martin, which is always fun, and George, in fact, because having watched an inordinate number of Treasury Select Committee hearings at the Bank of England, I think it provides absolutely no scrutiny whatsoever of the actual things that we care about and the individual decisions that MPC members make. It is all what Kate just said. It's all about trying to score political points, and it's basically, it'd be a good research product to see how much the governor actually answers questions, and it'll be about 90% of the time in front of the committee. It's a terrible, terrible committee with a few exceptions at the time of the financial crisis. So we must be able to find a better way of providing individual accountability. And I think that means that people should be just up where there's an amount of time that they have to answer questions for their vote, and that's instituted. And then, but I wondered, the question is, does the panel have any better ideas?
Well, one thing I've heard, Chris, is the idea of better resourcing the Treasury Select Committee, so better advisors, maybe seconded from the bank. I don't know, that would be a bit of conflict. But what do you think about, Martin, I know you want to come in, but Kate?
No, I think Martin should come in.
Martin, what?
Well, I was going to make a different point. I don't feel very strongly about this one. Chris and I can have a fight when we go back home. I've been thinking about, from my point of view, where accountability or where analysis has been really helpful. And this is orthogonal to what we said, something. There have been two big disasters, I don't think you can describe it any way, since the bank was made independent. The first was obviously the financial crisis, and the other was this tiny little overshoot of the inflation target we've been experiencing for the last 3 years. And my view is we learn from these. That's where we learn. So having mechanisms which will probably have to be ad hoc, but really serious, and they probably have to be done professionally to evaluate what went wrong, why, and what we should learn from it is very important. And the Ben Bernanke view of the forecasting, what it should be is a commission of inquiry chaired by Ben Bernanke with other distinguished members to tell us what went wrong and why, and whether there are useful lessons in taking in the global context. That's clearly what we should need. Was it okay or not? And similarly, in the financial crisis, to my knowledge, the only really competent and interesting official report was done by Adair Turner. It was very much a personal thing as chairman of the about-to-be destroyed FSA. But to my knowledge, there was never anything that asked, did the bank really, as an institution, screw this up completely? And they did. Now, so to me, regular scrutiny is less important, and the ideal models are the great 1930s evaluation done by Congress and the almost equally good one that they did after the financial crisis, which was incredibly good. We should have mechanisms that allow, maybe Parliament sets up a commission or whatever, somebody that actually evaluates what went wrong and not like what we're just doing with the COVID inquiry, which is wonderful theatre, but is going to contribute nothing, I'm sure, to our knowledge.
Okay. Kate, very last word, because we are
very quickly, one thing you could do which would have made my life more difficult going to the Treasury Committee would be if you'd had other some economists there adding to the questioning, and it was given me much greater problems than the main problem I had going to the Treasury Committee, which is staying awake. Mm-hmm. The other thing I was going to say, and since you referred to the COVID inquiry, it's very unusual for me to say anything which demonstrates an agreement with Dominic Cummings. It is all about theatre, and what you don't want is something that comes out that is all about process.
Exactly.
Process, you can do what you like with processes. It's the quality and thought that goes into the decision that matters.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm. Right. Less theatre and more economists.
We needed to know why our banking system was allowed to get to where it was.
Okay.
We got some of it. I mean, Adair did a really pretty good job, but that's unbelievably important.
Okay. Well, it's been a fantastic... We are out of time, unfortunately. I'm sure we can, if the panel are going to stay around, you can buttonhole them and take up some of these issues in more detail. But I just want to thank all of you. It's a really rich discussion. So thank you to Martin, to Kate, and to George. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was much more fun than I expected.
Thank you so much.
I was standing there like a fool for a bit. Well, there was no seat. Huh? No seat there? She just sat there. No, I did end up sitting for a bit.
All the questions are coming from here, so no need to go there.
Well, I actually had two this time.
Yeah?
Which was interesting enough. The questions weren't thick, but they were interesting enough. Sort of just repeated what I want to say here now.
No, that's great. I think this next session is